So today's sermon is about love. It's about a love that liberates and a love that allows for compassion, a love that allows us to see humanity of one another. I've chosen two stories from our Unitarian Universalist history where for each person, love was a public, forceful, and effective tool for them to use. They embodied this love and mercy. The first one is Fannie Barrier Williams, who is an African-American woman whose work opened education, employment, and other opportunities for African-American women after the Emancipation Proclamation. And the second is Reverend Theodore Parker, who is a white man who worked tirelessly in the decades before the Emancipation Proclamation. Both Parker and Barrier Williams demanded that they're primarily white churches do more. And like the story for all ages, that all we do be grounded in the morality of love. So for Fannie Barrier Williams, she lived from 1855 to 1944. Her parents and grandparents were free people, and she was educated in public schools in the North, as her parents and grandparents had been. They were the only Black family in Rockport, New York. Her father was a successful businessman, and he was also able to have leadership positions in the white church. An unusual story. But because she was sort of in this protected space, she was largely unaware of the plight of other African Americans. She graduated and she took a teaching job in the South, and this was post-Civil War by that time. And she said she immediately began to experience the discrimination and prejudice she had not experienced before. And she says, I quote, "I miss the training that would have made this continued humiliation possible to bear." After beginning to study at the New England Conservatory, she also experienced dehumanization, describing, "I never quite recovered from the shock and pain of my first bitter realization that to be a person of color and a woman is to be discredited, mistrusted, and often meanly hated." End of quote. She went on to marry a lawyer, Lang Williams, who lived in Chicago, and they attended the Unitarian Church. She had been raised Baptist, but then moved to Unitarianism. She was such an activist, she was invited to speak at the World Parliament of Religions in 1893. In all of her speaking events, including the World Congress of the Representatives of Women, she challenged the misuse of Christian ideas of the time. And she said, I quote, "The Negro was brought to this country by Christians for the use of Christians and has never been treated, estimated, engaged by what all are calling Christian ideas of right and wrong. The hope of dark races in America depend on how far white Christians can assimilate their own religion. At present, there seems to be no ethical attitude in public opinion toward people of color. White men and women are careless and meanly indifferent about the merits and rights." Unquote. So while in Chicago, she was trying to figure out how to do her part. And women's clubs in Chicago were very popular in that time. She tried to join a very progressive women's club of 800 people, and she was denied membership because of the color of her skin. But she had white allies, and she continued to push forward, and she was eventually admitted by a really large majority, but it took time. So she got this idea that these women's clubs need to be happening for women of color, and she was focused on African American women. She says because she was light-skinned and intelligent, she was confident. Because of her childhood experiences of being accepted, she was confident. But she knew that she had access to white society in a way that so many other people of color did not. So she started these clubs for solidarity, for hope, but even more importantly for her, through her eyes, was gaining skills, homemaking, parenting, and employment skills. Because she knew that formerly enslaved women who had recently been free, so many of them worked in the fields for 16 hours a day. So these were not skills that were available to them. She explains how the club system, the aims of a particular club are the establishment of kindergartens, mothers' meetings, sewing schools for girls, day nurseries, an employment bureau, and friendly visitors to people's homes. She especially focused on really young teenage girls who might have ended up in a life of prostitution had they not had the ability to be mentored and gain skills. She went on to be a founder of the Provident Hospital and the training school for nurses because, of course, so many people of color could not go to a nursing school and could not be treated in a medical facility. So she thought, we will do this ourselves. She eventually, along with Cecilia Parker Woolley, who I think is a Universalist, she's either Unitarian or Universalist, but they became good friends and they founded the Frederick Douglass Center, which becomes the forerunner of both the Urban League and the NAACP. Because she was a person of color, she was not written about in Unitarian Universalism until really about the last decade, which is why I tell her story this morning. I have the most incredible book in my office, which I probably will loan out to you. You can read her story and the story of many others. It's called Standing Before Us, Unitarian Universalist Women and Social Reform from 1776 until 1936. Many names you would recognize and several that you wouldn't because they haven't been written about until now. So I also want to tell you about the Reverend Theodore Parker. I want to contrast a woman of color with a white man. I'm so aware for white men right now that you are being asked so much about examining your privilege and examining things that are open to you, but I am also so mindful that it was white men, progressive white men, who were living out their values and their love, who really allowed eventually people of color to be able to vote and women to be able to vote. We could not have done that without them. So I want to tell you, before I talk about Theodore Parker, I want to read a couple quotes from him that you will attribute to other people, but they're actually his. And he wrote this a decade before the Gettysburg Address. Abraham Lincoln was a huge fan of Theodore Parker. So this is Parker's writing. A democracy that is a government of all the people, by all the people, for all the people. Of course, a government of the principles of external justice, the unchanging law of God. For lesser's sake, I will call it the ideal of freedom. And the second quote I have from him was written over a century before the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King used it and made it famous. But this is Theodore Parker memorialized in writing. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and my eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate its curve and complete the figure by the experience of my sight, but I can divine it by conscience. And from what I see, I am sure it bends toward justice. That is the magnificence of love of Theodore Parker. A fierce abolitionist, he died before the Emancipation Proclamation. There were many Unitarian and Universalist abolitionists. Many of them worked for educational efforts in communities, legislative efforts, and I don't want to discount that in any way, but Parker was boots on the ground. Parker was arrested. I don't want to do a spoiler. He saw the suffering of people up close and personal. So he was a Unitarian minister in the 1880s, and he was also, as well as being an abolitionist, he was a really strong advocate for the poor and the immigrant poor and getting education for immigrant children. And his views made him really unpopular with clergy people of the time. It also had a little to do with he didn't believe that Jesus was the God-human hybrid. He believed Jesus was just inspired by God, trying to live a moral and ethical life and teaching others to do the same. So Theodore Parker would get deeply entangled with other ministers of the time. And when the Fugitive Slave Law was passed in 1850 and enacted in 1851, it required that even free states turn in escaped enslaved African Americans. For any of you who already have encountered Theodore Parker's name, Bill Gould, are you here this morning? Wave at me. I know he's a huge Parker fan. Anyway, if you have encountered the story about him before, the one that is most often told is he would be writing his sermons on Saturday night with a sword on his desk and a pistol next to his right hand. And he did this because in Massachusetts, Parker welcomed runaway enslaved people to take refuge in his church, and if there wasn't enough room in his church, they were in his home. And it was dangerous for him to do so. And I want us to remember that story, but it's not actually what I want to focus on this morning. I want to talk about his commitment to hard, solid, moral thinking and action, and how he used his white privilege, and how he educated others. And he told others in the Unitarian tradition, your faith demands you do better. So he attended the meeting in 1851 of the Boston ministers, primarily Unitarian ministers, and there were a lot of them in Massachusetts. So Reverend Ezra Gannett spoke, and he said, the fugitive slave law must be obeyed, because otherwise, and I quote, if it not be obeyed, first we shall violate all human laws, and next there will be dissolution of the Union, unquote. So first, we will willy-nilly become lawbreakers of everything. We will have no internal code, and secondly, the Union will pull apart, which was, of course, prophetic. Parker was publicly forceful about calling out Gannett's distorted thinking. And he said, who are the people that would oppose the fugitive slave law? He said, there are people who have always been on the side of true law and order by not taking advantage of others. Their disobedience is one of the strongest guarantees that they will obey laws that are just, unquote. So Parker is saying people of conscience will only disobey laws that oppress. Then he turns to Gannett and he says, Mr. Gannett preaches a sermon to justify the fugitive slave law. And you notice he calls him Mr. Gannett. He doesn't give him the respect of calling him Reverend. Parker explains that he has the fugitive slaves in his church, and this is the crown of his apostleship and the seal of his ministry. He says, we have been told that we must not preach on this matter of slavery because it's an abstraction. Then it's the North was all right on the subject, and then it's because we have nothing to do with it. We'd have to go to Charleston or New Orleans. He says, but all we have to do is go down the street to our courthouses and our city offices. And he says, Mr. Gannett preaches this sermon to justify the fugitive slave law, demanding it should be obeyed, calling his church members to kidnap mine and sell them into bondage forever. All of this while Mr. Gannett calls himself a Christian and me an infidel. Parker says he will always violate the law. Tragically, Parker died of tuberculosis before the Emancipation Proclamation, and he was unable to see the outcome of his work. But he educated and inspired so many others who carried on the work. I feel as though he is a touchstone I go to when things get difficult. I was asked by Rabbi Ed to give some testimony at the legislature, and it was my touchstone was Theodore Parker, because I was nervous and I was a little bit afraid. So may he inspire all of us to this day. I hear that as a call for all people to live outside what our culture tries to hold out as a norm. What our culture tries to call a norm is white, able-bodied, successful, well-spoken, and not transgender. Parker's love for all of us lives on, and the love of Fannie Barrier Williams lives on. They both call people of faith to do more. So, at the end of Black History Month, and in a few weeks, I'm going to preach about the International Transgender Visibility Day, that we be asking ourselves what we can do to help. I went over this morning and pulled right off our bulletin board the Unitarian and Universalist College of Social Justice online seminar, Demilitarization and Abolition, Resisting Policing and Empiring. I would like someone to take up the challenge of researching this and writing up a little something that we stick out on our listserv, because maybe this is something some of us want to do. So may you be inspired as you go from this place to be in love and to be in kindness. Amen.